Every once in a while, your cube will start to lose its really nice feel, and this is typically due to lube starting to wear out of it. You can usually just reapply some lube and you're good to go. However, in other situations, your cube could start to feel gunky or the lube doesn't nearly respond as well. Now, this is usually a sign that it's time to clean out your cube. If you want to absolutely maximize the lifespan of your cube and be really thorough, every 4 to 6 weeks is usually when you'd want to clean. However, I don't clean my cubes that often. I usually go every 2-ish months, and that's usually fine. But again, if you want to be really thorough, every 4 to 6 weeks is like the sweet spot. So some of the items you'll need for cleaning out your cube are a paper towel or a rag, and another item you may need is a screwdriver. Now, some cubes still use screws, others like the WRM V10 don't use screws anymore, so you may not need a screwdriver. And for a little bit of cautionary advice, you're going to want to keep the hardware out of any water. There can sometimes be a lot of metal parts like screws, springs, maglev, and you don't want those getting any rust, or in the case of stickered puzzles, you don't want the water to damage those stickers. So now let's go ahead and get started. If you have a cube with a screw and it uses springs and you've lubed said springs, then what you can do is you can actually just right away totally unscrew the screw from the core and take out the spring. Make sure not to lose track of those. They are small, so they are pretty easy to lose. Once you've done that, you can start disassembling your cube pretty easy, like that. But if you have screws and maglev, you probably don't want to unscrew them all the way because when you take them out, the magnets will sometimes try to flip over and attract to each other, and the impact can sometimes cause them to crack, which would break the maglev. So now that we have that first layer off, all these other pieces are going to come out really easily. And we can now take the center caps off the rest of these and unscrew the rest of them. So something you can do to keep track of your screw and spring is to just leave the spring on the screw until it's time to clean it. That way it minimizes the chance of you losing it. So there is no right or wrong place to start, so we're just going to start with the corners here. So when it comes to cleaning these off, again, you can either use a paper towel or a rag. Both have their pros and cons. The nice thing about paper towels is that they're thin, so you're able to easily get into any kind of like really small space, be able to clean it out, whereas with a rag, it's a bit thicker and a little harder to reach those smaller places. The downside of using a paper towel is that they're really easy to break because they're really thin, whereas with a rag, it's much thicker and much more durable. Now you can always fold the paper towel to make it a little bit more thick, and then just to clean things off, you're just going to wipe down the pieces. Pretty simple, nothing really complicated to it. Then you're going to wipe down the stem and the base. And just try to clean off as much lube or dirt or gunk as possible. And make sure to get the underside of the base as well. So now that I've finished this piece, I'm going to set it off to the side and then just work on the rest of the corners. So now we're moving on to the edges, and we're going to do relatively a very similar thing where we just wipe down the main piece and everything. But for these tracks here, what we're going to do is we're going to take our paper towel and we're going to use our nail to just kind of get right in between those tracks to really clean them out. This is where I like having a paper towel as opposed to a rag. It's a little easier to get into those tracks and clean them out. But if you do only have access to a rag, then it should still work. It's just going to take a little bit more effort to try and clean them out. And now we can go ahead and finish cleaning off the rest of the piece. And then we'll just finish wiping down all the edges. So now that we finished the edges, I'm going to move on to the center pieces, and we're just going to pretty much do the same process, but first we're going to take out the adjustment system, and then we're going to just wipe down this whole piece. Now you shouldn't really need to clean out the inside of this piece because most of the lube, if any, would be on the inside of the adjustment piece, which is a little tricky to clean. So we're going to leave that to the side while we finish the rest of these center pieces. And now we're done with centers, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the core. This one is pretty simple. Again, you just wipe it down, make sure there's no lube and any hard to reach spots on there. And you're good to go. And then I'm just going to wipe off the caps. Sometimes you can get lube on your fingers from disassembling, and then when you're moving stuff around, it can get on the outside. So we're just going to wipe down the caps real quick. And now we can move on to the adjustment system and the screw and springs. So we're going to start with screws and springs, and I actually prefer using paper towels for this. So first we're going to clean off the screw, which is pretty simple. You just quickly wipe it down. But for the spring, you're going to have to be a little bit more gentle just because it is pretty thin metal and it can bend and you don't want it to get warped in any way. But all you really need to do is just kind of grab the spring a little bit and then just turn it with your other hand. Just wipe down as much as you can of that surface. Make sure there's no excess lube on there at all. Now for cleaning screws and springs, it really shouldn't take that long. There shouldn't really be a lot of lube on there, so this should be a relatively quick process. And now the last thing to do is to clean out any of these adjustment systems here, and we're actually going to use a screw for this. So we'll take the spring off and set it to the side, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a single layer of paper towel, wrap it around the head of the screw, and just stick it in the adjustment system, and just turn the adjustment system around it. You can really clean it out. And we'll just repeat that process for all of them. And now that we've finished cleaning the adjustment systems, we can go ahead and put them back in to the centers along with the screws. We can now go ahead and screw them back into the core. And be sure not to screw them in all the way, that way you can easily put the pieces back on. And we're just going to repeat for all the centers, the adjustment systems, and the screws. And something to take note of while you're reassembling these is your color scheme. If you put these centers on in the wrong order, the rest of the pieces won't line up and the colors won't match. So it should look something like this. White on top, orange in front, green to the right, red to the right of green, blue to the right of red, and yellow on the bottom. And from here we can go ahead and start to reassemble the cube. So a quick guide for reassembly, all you'll want to do is you'll want to get at least one edge in like this. And I like to put in an adjacent edge like this, and then the corner that goes between them, and then the edge that goes between these two centers. And then I like to build the rest of the bottom layer. It should look something like this. Then we can set it down, put in the remaining pieces for the second layer. And then for the edges and corners of the last layer, what you're going to want to do is lift up on the center and kind of twist your edge piece in, like that. And you'll do something similar with the corners, where you try to twist it in. And you do the same thing a couple more times until you're left with just two corners and one edge remaining. You'll want to put in both corners first. And then for the last edge, you're going to want to try and spread these pieces out as much as possible. Go in at an angle and kind of just twist it into place, and you should have a reassembled 3x3. Now, if the edge doesn't really want to go in and you're having a little bit of trouble, you can always loosen some of the centers. Just make sure you don't loosen them so much to where they fall out of the core. Now that the cube is fully cleaned out and reassembled, if you have a screw, you'll probably need to take some time to try and figure out where your tensions used to be. But once you've done all that, you can put your caps on. Then I like to wipe down the cube one last time to make sure there's no excess lube that somehow managed to get onto the outside of the pieces. And now you're good to go ahead and re-lube your cube, reset it up the way you had it, and you're good to go. And one last thing before you go, be sure to store your cubes in cube bags to prevent dust and dirt from getting inside, especially when you're traveling or going to competitions. That way you can prolong the amount of time between maintenance and cleaning out your cube.